Fiola, a junior at Rome Free Academy. It's May 23rd, 2001. I'll be interviewing Mr. Edward Quinn. He's a World War II veteran in the Pacific Theater. Okay, Mr. Quinn, after you graduated from high school, did you know you were going to be drafted on Monday?
We graduated from UFA, Utica, June 25th, 1942. And first of all, I more or less had my feet stuck in sand because on December the 8th, our principal at UFA invited all the boys to an assembly, and he said such a terrible tragedy had befallen the country the day before, and he offered all of us, and any that wanted it, our diplomas, which would be 6 months ahead of graduation if we wanted to join the service. Well, a number of the fellows, and I don't know how many, maybe up as far as 30, took him up on his offer. There were 600 in our class, and they all went in the Navy together. They joined up the Navy immediately. They all went together to Sampson and then the Great Lakes Training Center, and they were all assigned to the WASP, which was an aircraft carrier. And that aircraft carrier went down in the Battle of the Coral Seas in May of 42. We didn't graduate till June of 42. Well, all of a sudden there was gold stars appearing around the neighborhood, and I didn't want to make my mother a hero. I didn't want to be a gold star, so I dragged my feet rather than joining up immediately. So the following Monday after our graduation, we all lined up together in the same alphabetical order and got drafted. This was a formal draft in June of 42. But because the draft board hadn't filled all their assignments yet, again, I didn't resist. I was just lackadaisical. I waited for them to take the 19-year-olds. So they took all the 19-year-olds in January and February of early 43, and I went in March of 43 with everybody but one of my graduating class. One fellow had infantile paralysis and they rejected him. They took everybody else. They assigned us to Upton on Long Island, the dead of winter, little pup tents, no heat. We froze our tails off, and they took our IQ test, physical test, and then we were assigned. I was assigned to an infantry replacement battalion in South Carolina to get our basic infantry training. We were learning how to dig foxholes, and the sergeant came along one day with a clipboard. He said, "Any of you fellows want to go to college?" Well, that sounded a lot better than digging foxholes. So I stuck my hand up. He says, "Well," he says, "you fall out next Sunday morning on your own time and take a test." Well, it was another IQ test. So we finished our basic training, and in the meantime they sent me to Army Intelligence School. That was the second half of basic training. There was probably 100 of us assigned to that. We learned how to make maps, view a battlefield, draw it, put all the things on our drawings. We learned compass readings, night surveillance, how to go through enemy lines. Anyways, basic training was over, intelligence was over. They lined up the battalion, probably 2,600 men, and 3 of us were called out of line. The rest of them got on a boat. They went as part of the 29th Division. The other 2,600, they made Normandy, first wave Normandy. I can't believe that there's too many of them that exist today. The 3 of us that were pulled out of line were sent to Mississippi State College. I was one of them. They gave me a year of engineering in Mississippi. That program ended in January 1944. And at that point was the big start of the big push in Europe. The invasion was going to be in June of '44, and the big push was on in the Pacific. So they canceled the program, and they gave me an option of which division I wanted to be part of. I was still a private, but by then I had a year of college. I had all the intelligence school. They assigned me to the 98th Division, which is a division out of Watertown, but it was in Camp Rucker, Alabama. I no more than got out of Mississippi State College, crossed the line over into Alabama. We were on a train, got new equipment, Fort Lewis, Washington. 5 days later, I was in Hawaii. And what the Army was doing then was giving jungle training and amphibious training in Hawaii. And again, for some reason or other, I was pulled out of there and sent to like a Corps headquarters. Now, this is top echelon Army tactics and training, which would be to prepare for an invasion of certain islands. So this was a company, it's hard to believe, but it was a company headed by a 2-star general, a brigadier general. He had 16 full colonels, 16 light colonels, and 110 officers, and 400 men. And what it was supposed to, their mission was that if anything happened to MacArthur's headquarters, or a Corps headquarters, or even a division, if somebody was lost in a division operation, people would be taken out of this Corps headquarters until to serve in that capacity until a replacement could be found. So this is about the time that Roosevelt and Nimitz and MacArthur had their great conference in August of 1944 as to which way the war was going to proceed in the Pacific. Nimitz was in charge of the Central Pacific, the Gilberts, the Marshall Islands, and he had the Marine divisions and some Army divisions, and Nimitz invaded Saipan and Okinawa. MacArthur was coming up through his Eiling-Happen campaign, going through New Guinea, Morotai, Halmahera, and then into the Philippines. To me, Nimitz was an assault group. Take that island, create an Air Force base on it, and make another 500-mile jump. MacArthur was doing the same thing, but he was isolating a lot of places like Rabaul, Truk, and he made overland, but he was using the Army, where Nimitz had the Marines. And this Corps headquarters was then assigned, that I was in, MacArthur's command. I caught up with MacArthur 2 years after he started his island hopping campaign. I caught up with MacArthur and his group in September of 1944 in New Guinea. So I was in New Guinea, and then we made the invasion of Leyte. And they broke the command up so nobody got wiped out, so they took all of the 400 men and they assigned them to different divisions that were landing the very first day in Leyte. I was assigned to the 7th Division, which was California National Guard. They had already fought battles in Attu and Kiska in Alaska and Kwajalein. That's their history. I landed in the 3rd wave with them at Dulag in Leyte. I had no mission. The first thing that happened to me, again, lucked out like mad. The first 2 waves went in. We landed dry. In other words, the landing craft came down, the ramp came up. We walked ashore. The battle was now 200 yards in front of us. And lo and behold, the first 2 waves went by a machine gun nest that was still occupied. The machine gun started firing. We all dropped with our nose into the sand. Right next to us, there was already an armored bulldozer ashore. The armored bulldozer was in operation. He saw the machine gun nest. He just lowered his blade, went over, took off the top of it, did a wheelie in the machine gun nest, and that solved that problem. The very first night, we were all told, dig our foxholes, do not stick your head above the foxhole. Anything appears above you, shoot it. It won't be us. So all night long, they'd had traversing machine gun fire from our side, so any Japs that were coming at us were being mowed down, but they couldn't tell. The next morning, I had my colonel and my sergeant in the same foxhole. It was a large foxhole. We just put our backs to each other. Anybody appeared above us, you shot. We went through the night very calmly. Nothing happened. Wake up the next morning, bullhorn came on. Everybody up. Along came a captain. He says, you and you. He says, there's a number of Japanese around you. Bury them. Looked at him like this. He says, there's a tank over there with a bulldozer blade on it. Make yourself a big ditch. He says, get them in there. By 11 o'clock, everything's going to stink around here. In the 104, 110 degree heat, bodies start stinking real quick. Fellow in the foxhole and myself, we just put our belts together, lassoed the Japanese leg, dragged them into the slit trench. 20 minutes, 28 Japanese, which you could throw spitballs where they were from where we were. They were having their little banzai attack, and the machine guns had cut them down. The following night, two of us were sent out on observation posts. They pushed us 300-400 yards into the jungle. We were supposed to warn anybody if any more infiltration. We did shoot that night. And then we were fully organized after that, and so anybody that had, I was like an operations sergeant. So any operations sergeant on the line that was wounded or whatever, sick or whatever, I would take their place until a replacement. So that went on for a month. I was assigned to different outfits, only on a loan basis, because this company I was in had no mission unless MacArthur's headquarters or a Corps headquarters was overrun and they needed somebody. So we kept the operations of the island, the operation intelligence, where the Japs were, how many there were, what organizations were facing us. But this was on a piecemeal basis. We had no authority except if something happened. So we were all farmed out piecemeal wherever there was a replacement was needed, and once a replacement was found, we were delegated back. So what we worked on was photo overlays, dropping surrender leaflets. There wasn't one day from then to the end of the war that my life was the same every day. It was exciting. I was literally stupid for the dangers I faced, but you get the impression that you're invincible. If you go through it a few times, you don't get wounded, you don't get shot, and you're not dead, pretty soon you get this mindset that you're invincible and can't be. A typical day would be to work on overlay maps, help the map makers make maps. You might be sent out to drop surrender leaflets. You might be sent behind the Jap lines. I probably spent 10 or 12% of my time on the island or other islands behind the Jap lines, anywhere from a 2-man patrol, a platoon-sized patrol, 30 men. Sometimes we were sent out with the whole company to lay an ambush. Was doing that in Masbate Island when I got wounded. I was laying behind a log one day, and a shell came in and landed on the other side of the log. I had a lot of ringing in my ear, but I never went to the hospital or anything because there was no hospitals behind the Jap lines. There was, in fact, the island I was on, there was only 8 Americans. They usually assigned a captain and a sergeant to each resurrected Philippine National Guard companies. So there'd be 200, as those pictures will show you, 200, 250 Filipino former National Guards, because when the Japanese come in, they surrendered. And then when the Americans invaded the island, and then what they do is invade the island, resurrect the former constabulary or the former National Guard, arm them again, pull out our assault troops, and assign a captain and a sergeant to each company. Basically, and if you get it down to thumbtacks, is to make sure they're earning their pay. We now put them back on the payroll. So they made them run operations to drive the Japs crazy, to keep them off guard so they weren't planting crops. The Japanese were pushed into the deep jungles, and they were reduced to, well, their radios were rusted out, their guns weren't working too much anymore, and their K rations had certainly long run out. They were reduced to eating yams and bananas and whatever else they could find in the jungle. And this was part of, to me, it was part of MacArthur's strategy. He sucked in all the reserves throughout the Philippines into Leyte. Leyte became his killing grounds. We lost, I think, 5,600 men on Leyte. The Japanese lost over 110 to 115,000 because MacArthur starved them to death, and he kept them under constant harassment, and he kept rotating our divisions into battle with tremendous amount of artillery and every kind of weapon we had, and he had an ample supplies. And if you look back in history, MacArthur was tremendously criticized because in Leyte he was using up more ammunition than they used up in Normandy. But when you get down to the end, his end results were there was tremendous amount of Japanese casualties and deaths, and very, very few. I'm sure the 29th Division on Utah Beach, the casualties were probably 4 times in one division is what MacArthur had in his whole campaign in the Philippines. Well, at least on Leyte and the Southern Command. And that brings you up to probably February, March of 45. And from there on, we invaded other small islands as part of the 8th Army. MacArthur took his 6th Army and went up into Luzon. The 8th Army was headed by Lieutenant General Eichenberger. And a 3-star general, and he invaded probably 10 or 15 different islands with his assault divisions, which he only had 2 or 3 of, but he did it piecemeal, and then brought in what I called his cleanup divisions. Once he brought in the assault troops, which were trained assault troops, then he'd bring in his second-rate divisions and just harass the Japs from there on. Not a sustained campaign. Now, he had a sustained campaign in Mindanao. That was our bloodbath. The 26th Division went in with 13,000 men, and before they were through on Mindanao, they suffered over 26,000 casualties because they had to replace the division almost 3 times over. The first 13,000 were wounded, killed, 13,000 again, 13,000 again to sustain the campaign. And in Mindanao, they had to not only fight the Japanese, they had to fight the Moros. The Moros was a group of indigenous Filipinos that MacArthur was fighting back in 1926. And the Philippine government is still fighting them today. They want their independence in Mindanao. This is where you find all these missionaries and things who were just captured this last year by the Moros. The Moros are a very fierce race. They're probably born Filipino, but they probably came from South China back in the 1500s, or even back the year 1000. It's a whole history on that you can get into. Later on in the war, as the war was ending, we had captured Japanese prisoners. Did a lot of interrogations. I was one of the bigger Army sergeants, so they used to use me to hold a machine gun on the prisoners and looked like I was gonna kill them. Just play acting to get them to give us their name, rank, and serial number, and where they were, what organizations they were, what their conditions were. This went on for quite some time, and then this information was fielded back to the companies that were on the line. We did this on Palawan Island. Palawan Island, prior to the war, was the world's biggest leopard colony. It's a disease where the flesh and everything disintegrates. So there's no cure for leprosy. There wasn't in those days. So the Philippine government, anytime they found a leopard in any of their other islands, they shipped them off to Palawan. When I was there was about 5,000 lepers. They were living in little grass tents, probably not much bigger than that desk. So their conditions were absolutely horrible, beyond description. But what we were sent in there with Japanese prisoners, which were interrogated, and we got them to write surrender leaflets. And we mimeographed the surrender leaflets by the thousands, flew over the island in a PBY, which you'd love to have. That's a Catalina flying boat, big airplane, 2-motor. Dropped the surrender leaflets on the part of the island that the Japanese were on, then would form patrols and try to get them to surrender, which they wouldn't. We got ambushed on Palawan Island one morning. All survived. And, you'll find letters in here. There's a letter there somewhere. And in World War II, the Army still had integration that they didn't. So colored troops were put in outfits completely colored. There was 2 famous divisions. The 92nd Division was colored. They shipped that to Italy. The 93rd Division was sent to the Philippines. You see by the letter, I was assigned to the 93rd as a white enlisted man, which they had no white enlisted men, so we had patrols, and it was with the 93rd Division that the ambush occurred. And we were very welcome, treated beautifully. They guarded our prisoners while, overnight somebody had to sit with them. And, also took the prisoners to the western Mindanao Islands towards the end of the war. At the end of the war, which the atomic bombs, I think, were dropped the 6th and the 9th of August, and then hostilities ceased, even though the surrender wasn't signed in Tokyo Bay until I think the 2nd of September. So, in the first part of the war, the cruiser Houston was sunk in the Battle of the Java Seas. The Japanese rescued a number of them, of our sailors, and they held them in Kendari in the Celebes Islands. So at the end of the war, why the Navy wanted those prisoners back was a priority, but the Army had the facilities to get there. So we had a joint task force, and we used a PBM, Patrol Martin bomber, which would hold about 80 men. So we thought we'd get down there to Kendary and see if what we could rescue of the Jap prisoners. What we didn't know was in early 1945, the Japanese put all the prisoners on a freighter, shipped them to Japan, and we sunk it. We sunk their freighter. So these fellows that were on the cruiser Houston from early 42 to early 1945 were held in Japanese prisons in Kendary and then Macassar. And they lived for 3 years, and we killed them. Unknowingly, our submarine sunk. We get down there, and we found cells. In fact, I found a cell where a fellow from Clinton, New York, had scratched his name in the wall. But he tried to escape, and they beheaded him. So this became part of the first part of the Atrocity Investigation Commission. It followed the commander of the Kendary Naval Base that did the beheading was brought to the Manila Yamashita trials. Now, I can't spell that for you, but that's where MacArthur had his Nuremberg trials. They were also held in the Pacific. They were held in Manila. Also, there was trials in Tokyo where Tojo and a number of the Japanese hierarchy were sentenced. But the Yamashita trials were held in Manila. And the commander of the naval base at Kendary that beheaded the fellow from Clinton.
You were on the atrocity committee, right?
Well,
Did you?
I worked for it. Let's say I'm sure that there was a lot smarter people. I was a sergeant. I was there. I pulled the information together.
Did you have any special assignments?
No, there was no special assignments. All this information was turned in as to who, and you'll find some of the photographs here, and the name of the commander. That's in these photographs.
When you were scouting behind the enemy lines, you said you patrolled with like 2 people. What was your objective? Just
The objective was not to get into firefights, just to report back the fact that there was Japanese activity in that area or there was none. They were just as happy to find out that there was no activity. We ran into no resistance. We were not resistance. We weren't to get into any resistance. This was 2-man patrols, sometimes 6-man patrols. We were probably the forerunners of, not Rangers, but Green Berets. But we were not in there to kill anybody. We were in there just for intelligence information, get the lay of the land, how thick the jungle was the kunai grass 12 feet high that you couldn't work your way through. As time went on, we were sent in as ambush. But that was with larger groups. That would sometimes be a full company of guerrillas, but not American troops. The American troops, the ones I was with, anywhere from 2-man to 6-man, but no firefights. We were armed. We had a radio. Every night, 5 o'clock, we were to report back to base on the radio. This usually lasted 5 days at a time. And I lucked out all the time never got into a firefight, never got into an ambush, never got shot at during these patrols, never seen evidently.
How were you placed behind the enemy lines? Did they fly you?
Once fly in to just a field, most of the time you walk, you're on the same island. We carried a K rations. We took the box of K rations, we split it between two of us. And when they ran out, there's usually enough in there for about 5 days. And we weren't in that far, anywhere from 2 miles to 10 miles. These islands weren't that big. It wasn't, you know, the map of France or anything. We weren't, you know, the French resistance or anything. What was nice in the sense of that war versus Vietnam, you knew all the time the Japanese were in uniform. They at least looked like soldiers. I'm so thankful with my job that I didn't have to do it in Vietnam, where I didn't know the difference between a North Vietnamese and a South Vietnamese sympathizer. Who was what? Who was going to shoot you? Who was going to pull a grenade out from under her skirt and throw it at you? We didn't have that problem. There was Filipinos there, and you recognized them. They were farmers, or they were rice growers. We didn't have the problems they had in Vietnam, thank God, or I don't think I'd be here.
You said in your outline that you said while spending time with the 42nd Filipino Battalion, they took off their shoes.
Oh, yeah.
What would that do?
Well, I can't describe a jungle to you. I can't describe the thickness of it. But a lot of times you'd use a stream as the only passageway. That was the trails. The trails would come through a jungle, hit a stream, and maybe go 200 yards or 1,000 yards in the stream. You'd walk anywhere from your knees up to your waist in the stream, and then you'd come out of the stream and find the trail again, and off you'd go. Well, the Filipinos never wore shoes in their life to start with. So when the Army equipped them, they gave them shoes. Well, they wanted them for their Sunday best, so they tied the laces together, hang them around their neck on the trails to save them for the dance on Saturday night. It's the only shoes they had. It was a badge of honor, holding a pair of shoes. But the Americans' feet were soft. They wore shoes all their life. You hit these trails, and you get in the water, your shoes would shrink. So you were too dumb to put your laces together and hang them around you. And you knew damn well, because of the leeches in the stream, you didn't want them on your. That's the first thing you did when you come out of a stream, was drop your pants and get somebody to light up a cigarette to burn off the leeches. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
But you'd take your shirt up and roll it up. Is there any leeches up there? Sometimes there would, sometimes there wouldn't.
That was a big problem, checking.
Well, there were bloodsuckers. Leeches were a bloodsucker. About 3 inches long, had about almost a 1-inch mouth. Like a big worm, big fat worm. The only way you get them off is take a lit cigarette and they'd drop.
The G1s, the intelligence group?
G2 is intelligence.
G2s. While you're interpreting photographs, were there specific things you were looking for? Like, You were looking for airfields, but like things
Well,
that were hidden. Did you
how
know?
many airplanes on an airfield? How many men that you figured in their tents or what? How well was the island protected? On the Yap Island, we figured there was anywhere from 80 to 110 planes. We never invaded Yap, but we so pulverized it with the 58th Task Force, bombing it continuously. Every time the fleet went by, they used it as target practice. Let's say the fleet was going to another island, truck or a ball, or up in the Marianas, they'd bomb these islands just to keep them off base and keep them from being resupplied. Pretty soon Yap Island became redundant. We never went there, but we eliminated a heck of a thorn that would be on our backside if we bypassed it. So we reduced it to junk. But these were the photographs that tell the higher authorities how much was left on that island to bomb. Whether 3 planes were left out of their 110, ignore it. If they still had 80 planes there, we went back again and again and again.
While you were with the guerrillas, did you have any problems, like communicating with them, or?
Oh no, no. Now, what they usually assign, the guerrillas assign 2 very well spoken Filipino that knew English, and I imagine English was taught in the schools. You know, America, U.S. owned the Philippines from 1898. MacArthur and his command was in the Philippines. There wasn't a spot in the Philippines that the American Army didn't have beautiful maps and knew what the conditions were. It was well mapped ahead of us. Somewhere in the pictures there you'll see a picture of a Filipino school. And that was cement. It was floors in it and all. I mean, it wasn't out in the jungle without, with a grass shack. No problem with communications. I imagine when they got to Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, they had a lot of problems. We had no problems. We also recruited absolutely guerrillas for pay in Lady when we first got there. The Filipino people literally rose up. We were their liberators as MacArthur came back. Truly, I would imagine 99.9% of the population was to get rid of the Japanese. The Japanese were very oppressive when they controlled it for the 3 years from 42 to 45. It was the same liberation that is in Europe to get the Nazis out of power. But the language, we had no language barrier.
After you had your ear blown out, were you sent home, or did you?
Oh, no. In fact, all I had was ringing in the ear. In fact, the only time I wound up was in a hospital. I got carried out of my body, but only because I had ulcerated blisters on my feet. I couldn't walk. From walking in the streams, the shrinking of the shoes, and sometimes walking probably 10 or 15 miles through jungles, like walking through 40 miles of downtown Rome. You cut your way through the jungles, and it took a lot of time and a lot of effort. I remember one morning, I don't think we went 50 yards in 2 hours. That's across this library. Cut your way through.
You were given machetes then?
Carried a machete, I carried a Colt 45, I carried a Thompson machine gun, and a machete.
Was that the standard equipment for everybody?
When you did patrols, you were allowed to carry anything you wanted. The supply sergeant would give you a cannon if you wanted the blessed thing. If you wanted a bazooka, which would be useless, you could have a bazooka if that's what your little heart desired. You could carry all the ammunition you wanted. I usually carried about 135 rounds. They fit both the Thompson machine gun, which is a 45 caliber, and a Colt pistol, which was a 45 caliber. The Japanese hated them because either one, if they were charging you and you had a Thompson or you had a Colt, their body would go backwards if you hit them 10, 12, 15 yards ahead, and that's all you needed because you didn't get a panoramic view of anything. All the action took place anytime I was in it was probably 12 or 15 yards away, 45 feet at most. And the stopping power of a Thompson, especially if you let out 6 bullets, it was tremendous. The bodies would go backwards.
You were scared of the guns then?
The Japanese were scared of the Thompsons because they had single-shot 25 caliber rifles. They didn't carry handheld machine guns. They didn't have them. Not that I ever ran into.
After the war, after the Japanese surrendered, were you sent home then?
No, because you came home by a point system. For every month that you were in the Army, you were allowed 1 point. For every month you were overseas, you were allowed an additional point. Now, certain decorations were given 5 bonus points. When the war ended, you had to have somewhere around 130 points. Very few people I was with had those, except the old National Guard. There was brought in the Army in 1940. They had them because they were overseas 4 years, so they had 60 points, 48 points for overseas, probably 2 or 3 battles. They had the points. They should have been allowed first. Somebody had been in 5 to 6 years. I was only in 3 years. So what happened was those fellows went home almost immediately. They got home in probably September, October of 45. Then they dropped the threshold to 85 points. I had 81. So I went to my colonel, saluted, and said, I have a request that I be given an air medal. I have 140 flying hours of dropping surrender leaflets. He looked at me a little foolishly. I said, well, I was getting shot at, even though I wasn't in any air combat in my little L5. And I said, I understand that a Major Prather, who was one of my commanders, got an air medal, and he was running messages from Lady back to Guam. I said, he wasn't over enemy territory. So that evening, when the general's aide-de-camp came to where I was in my tent, And he says, you know, he says, Sergeant Quinn, he says, you've got the general over a barrel. He says, we can't give air medals to infantry. You're classified infantry. He says, Major Prather is general staff. He's been in the Army for years, he's on the general staff. He says, the general requests that you forget everything. I says, forget what? So about a week and a half went by, and the company commander came to me and he says, you're to report tomorrow to General Eichenberger, who was our theater commander. He says, I don't know what you've done now. He says, but you must be in big trouble. So I went up the next morning to 8th Army headquarters, reported it to the gate. And there's 2 MPs there, about 6'9", silver helmets on, and I said, I'm Sergeant Quinn, I'm to report to General Eichenberger. He looked at his clipboard. He says, yeah, he says, go right over there. He says, there's a theater over there. He says, there's a major standing at the gate. He says, report to him. So I went over. Major told me to go in and sit in the second row, 3rd seat from his little clipboard. A couple of minutes later, attention! In comes General Eichenberger. Bang, 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 everybody got a medal. I got a Bronze Star. There's a citation there of what I did when I was in Leyte and in the other islands. But that's, the Bronze Star gave me 5 points. I went from 81 to 86. I was on my way home. That was the only reason I went after the medal.
When you went home, what'd you do the first thing when you returned?
Well, first thing I went to see my girlfriend, which it took me another year. Marriage was held up for 3.5 years. She was a sophomore when I left. I wanted to marry her then, but her mother wouldn't let her go. She was only 15. So we did get married. So instead of being married 60 years, we're now only married 55.
And you went to work at Revere afterwards?
First I went to Syracuse University for a year. Then we got married. I went to work for Revere as a clerk. When I got through, I was the plant controller, number 2 man, assistant to the general manager.
Is there anything that sticks out of your mind about the war after looking back at that?
Well, it was a tremendous cause of liberty. There was a tremendous surge of patriotism throughout the country. Probably not since the Revolution, maybe the Civil War, and then World War II, because of the Axis powers and the suppression of humanity by the Axis powers. There was a tremendous surge, and I haven't seen anything even remotely like it since. Maybe a little bit of Panama invasion. Noriega was being a real arse about suppression of people down there and his cocaine distribution, but that is one little pimple versus against World War II. The Korean War was somewhat like it, but not the Kennedy Wars. To me, Bobby Kennedy and the Kennedy clan started the Vietnam War. in their Bay of Tonkin that there was no love for the Vietnam War. There was no surge of do-goodism. Look at the way the Vietnam veterans were treated when they came home. There was no point to it. We weren't trying to keep the Vietnamese people out of the communist camp.
I thank you very much for doing this interview with us.
Got any?
I just
Probably a few things there.
like to look over some of these pictures, the camera and stuff. The dropping the leaflets, the surrender leaflets, why did you do that?
Well, to tell the Japanese we wouldn't kill them if they did surrender. It was a free pass to get out of the war. Free pass. We'd feed them, we'd clothe them, we'd treat them decently. Very, very few surrendered. They had this shogun mentality, rather die for the emperor than be disgraced as being a prisoner. A lot of the prisoners we captured were borderline malnutrition because we cut off their supplies. A lot of them we picked up on stretchers. I would say half that I ever ran into. We nourished them back to health. In a prisoner of war camp, we didn't mistreat them. We never shot any after we got them to them. Once they made up their mind to surrender, I never saw any pull out daggers or hand grenades to try to blow up on Americans. I didn't see that. It could have happened. I don't doubt that it might have or did, but I don't know. I didn't see it. MacArthur, to me, was the best general in the war. He had one thought, was to come back to the Philippines, free the islands again. He made a tremendous administrator when he went to Japan as the administrator after the war. I think he was right that the Korean War, that he should have dropped a few atomic bombs on Peking and ended that war. There was no sense in having 50,000 dead Americans in Korea. Now, Truman was right, in my mind, to dropping the atomic bombs to start with. That saved, to me, they've admitted, 1 million American casualties that would have happened if we invaded Japan. Through June, through September, we were getting ready for the Japanese invasion island. That was going to happen in November of 45. And then the big push was going to be January of 46. 1 million American lives were saved. So we killed 200,000 Japanese. That's a long way from having 1 million casualties, and I'm sure the Japanese would have suffered their same amount of casualties if we went into their home islands. They had to have casualties, tremendous casualties. No, I think MacArthur was the greatest general we had. He was far more superior than Eisenhower or Mark Clark.
Thank you very much for doing this interview with us. I enjoyed talking with you. I hope you enjoyed it.